Hello, welcome to Thor Talk, the show all about Marvel's resident god of thunder. On this episode of Thor Talk, the Skald of the Realms forces Thor to live out a story that he had long forgotten. In Ullr's Hall, Thor once again lives out the tale of how he first came to the Utgardlands, and how he was humbled there. Let's take a look at Thor's first journey into mystery on Thor Talk.
I am Thor the Thunderer, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, and this world is under my protection.
The Immortal Thor number 6 was written by Al Ewing and was published in January of 2024. The issue begins with stanza 42 of the Viking Age poem Grimnismal, and it reads as follows. Ullr's and all the gods' favor shall have, whoever first shall look to the fire. In Grimnismal, the god Odin goes in disguise to the hall of King Geirröð, but Geirröð is told that a magician matching Odin's description will try to bewitch him. So, when Odin arrives, Geirröð captures him and tortures him by putting him between two fires for 8 nights. The king's son Agnar gives Odin a drink and says that the king was wrong to torture him without cause. Odin says that Agnar will never receive a greater reward for a single drink, and begins to reveal who he really is by describing different aspects of the worlds, such as the halls at which the gods live. Different translations have very different interpretations for stanza 42. Some have Odin saying that Ullr and all the gods will greatly reward anyone who removes the fires that have been used to torture him. Other translations, including the one that Ewing chose, imply that it is describing some sort of ritual involving fire. Both would make sense, but it's clear that Ewing chose this translation because Thor and Loki are participating in a ritual involving fire and the god Ullr. In fact, I would go as far as to say that this entire opening sequence, where Loki describes Ullr and why he's connected to this ritual, is based entirely on this stanza. The story begins with Dario Agger reading a comic, and Amora then beckons him to keep reading. Soon we see a very similar scene as the one shown in the comic play out. Loki, in his aspect as the Skald of the Realms, and Thor the Allfather gather around the yew fire in Utgardlands, the hall of Ullr. Ullr the bow god and maker of magics, who stoked the yew fire around which skalds tell their stories. He who rides on a ship of bone. He is called the son of Sif, and the stepson of Thor by the mortals, but Loki says that his true parents are unknown. Thor agrees that the mortals often speak with great knowledge about what they do not know. However, they may be closer to the truth on this. Since Thor is now the Allfather, all of the Aesir are his kin. If lost Ullr is ever found, then Thor would gladly offer his hammer to help. But the mortals do not know everything, and if any knew his full tale, then they could not sleep one night untroubled. Here, Thor describes Ullr as being lost, and I would absolutely agree with him on that. In Journey into Mystery number 113, a god named Ullr appears and he participates in a duel that young Thor and Loki witness. But it's not clear if this is the same Ullr or just a god who shares his name. But regardless, this is this version of Ullr's only appearance. Not only is Ullr apparently missing in Marvel, but I would say he is one of the greatest examples of a lost god in Norse mythology. He has very few mentions in Norse sources, yet there are many places in Sweden and Norway named after him, which indicates he was fairly popular at some point. We have one story about Ullr, and it's a brief mention in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum. It's not a very reliable source, and all it says is that Odin was briefly banished and Ullr ruled in his place, but when Odin returned, Ullr was driven out and then killed by the Danes in Sweden. It's possible that Thor's brief mention of Ullr being lost is a reference to this story, and Ullr is somewhere in exile, but we'll have to wait and see. Regardless, I really like that Ewing decided to bring Ullr into the forefront of Thor comics, and that he decided to include as many details as he could from the Norse sources. Loki's mention of a ship of bone that Ullr rides comes from a line in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum. Loki also describes Ullr as being the god who stoked the yew fire. This partly comes from stanza 42 of Grimnismal, but we also know that Ullr had a strong association with yew trees. His hall is called Udallir, or Yew-dale, and he's also associated with bows and skis, which are both usually made of yew wood. Thor and Loki are in Utgardlands in the story, and the walls of Ullr's hall have shields with bows on them. Ullr was the son of Siv, but his father wasn't Thor, so he was called Thor's stepson. Interestingly, Loki makes mention of this to Thor, but while both of them are aware that the mortals say this, it's apparently not true. So the Norse myths as we know them apparently exist relatively unchanged in the Marvel Universe, even though the Marvel versions are different. These differences could be due to different versions of the gods from previous cycles of Ragnarok, or just the mortals being mistaken. Now Loki returns to the task at hand. A fire of yew spits and roars. The fire is powerful, and in Udallir, Ullr's own hall, the magic is powerful. Great magic for a great tale, but to live in a tale may be to die in it. For a tale retold may not go as you remember. Thor agrees that memory is always a trickster, and while he does remember his time in the Utgard-Lands from ancient days, his memories may not be fully trusted. Still, Tornos told him that it was Gaea who made a deal with the Elder Gods, so Thor must confront her, but he must do so with the truth. Loki warns him that even a true tale may twist and turn when retold. It may kill him. Loki was called on as the Skald of the Realms, and in this aspect, he is Thor's enemy. Thor knows this, for the storyteller must often be the enemy in order for the story to have weight. But he is the All-Father, and he must know what he must know. Here we get a more clear idea of why Loki is Thor's enemy when he's in his Skald of the Realms aspect, and the reason is simple but interesting. In order for a story to have stakes, the storyteller does have to place obstacles and hardships on the protagonist, which basically make him the protagonist's enemy. This is true for any storyteller, but it seems when Loki goes through this ritual, it is more literal. Thor is going to have to live through this story, and if the story changes to the point that it includes his own death, he will die from Loki's story. At last, Loki begins the tale by speaking the magic words. Once, upon, a time. The tale begins with a young Thor and Loki looking out at a mysterious black bridge which reaches into unknown lands. Loki says they should turn back, and reminds Thor that Odin told them never to cross the Vima River. Thor strikes his brother. Who is this who calls himself Loki, yet lives by rule and law? Take thy true shape, villain, Thor commands it. Loki gives in, and Thor says his cowardly squeal reveals the true Loki. While he has agreed to cross the bridge, Loki says that it is strange that they have walked by Vimir 100 times and— Wait, I have a question of my own before we continue. Was I truly so unkind in those days? So cruel? Mostly, Loki says, this was before he learned humility after all. It was wrong of me to treat you so. We were kin. I do regret it, Loki. Loki pauses for a moment, and then at last says that we all have regrets. Initially, Loki's answer seems like he may not fully forgive Thor, but looking back to the first issue, it's clear that there's more going on. Loki has done something. We don't know what or how it will affect Thor, but he internally apologizes to Thor for what he has done. Yet he hasn't said it out loud to Thor. And the fact that Thor so clearly demonstrates how much he loves his brother seems to really make Loki feel guilty. While Thor is sorry he was so unkind to Loki, I kind of like seeing Thor and Loki really act like brothers. As Loki was saying, the bridge was not here before, but Thor argues that is all the more reason to cross it, for it may be gone tomorrow. Soon a dark forest appears with eyes peering at them, and a large gate stands before them. The gate creaks open, and Loki tries to turn back, but Thor grabs him and scolds him for turning down such a dramatic invitation. Thor drags a reluctant Loki through the gate, and into the unknown. Thor did not act with humility, even as the blades of grass became as tall as trees, for what could harm Odin's own son? The story of Thor and Loki journeying to the Utgard-Lands has been told before, in Thor number 272 and in the Norse myth found in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. There are some differences in Ewing's version not found in the original comic or in the myth. In both of the other versions, there are no mysterious black bridges or gates that open as if to invite them. It seems more like Thor just happens to come across the Utgard-Lands in the original comic and in the myth, but here he is clearly invited, and he chooses to accept the invitation. However, the biggest difference is probably that the Immortal Thor has Thor with his axe Jarnbjorn, since he hasn't yet proved himself worthy of Mjolnir, whereas he has Mjolnir in Thor number 272 and in the original myth. Also, in the original myth, Thor and Loki are accompanied by Thor's two human servants, Thjalfi and Röskva, but they are absent from both comic versions. Loki laments that they are hopelessly lost, and that he is very hungry. Thor suggests that they seek out shelter, and soon spots a cave where they can stay. It is a large cave with 5 passages, and walls that are not made of rock, but of something skin. The cave then shakes, with both brothers being shaken out of it like lint is shaken out of a pocket. They look up to see a giant far larger than any giant they have ever seen. The cave they were in was not a cave at all, but the giant's glove. Sensing no hostility, Thor asks the giant his name so that he may thank him for his hospitality. The giant muses that he has not needed a name until this exact moment, but says that they can call him Skrymir, and he laughs at the fact that he is copying the copycat. Okay, spoilers for a story that is literally 1,000 years old, but Skrymir is actually Utgard-Loki in disguise, and that's what makes his comment so interesting. He laughs that he is copying the copycat when he chooses the name Skrymir on the spot. We learned in the first issue that Skrymir the Frost Giant is not Utgard-Loki from the myth, but he used his name in order to emulate his power. So it seems that Skrymir is actually the Frost Giant's real name, and Utgard-Loki used that name for his disguise as payback. Thor and Loki have no idea what he is talking about. Loki worries that he is insane, and decides to go home, until Skrymir reveals that he has food. He says they can help themselves to the food in his bag, while he takes a nap under the tree. All they need do is untie the knot, which is so loose that even a child could undo it. Before he sleeps, Skrymir says they may also accompany him to meet his king, who would surely grant many royal treasures to the tiny ambassadors. They could smell the food, fine meats, cheeses, pickling brine, a smorgasbord for 2 hungry young gods. All they needed to do was open the bag. Thor's axe Jarnbjorn could not cut the rope, and Loki's enchantments did nothing either. Thor puts his godly strength to work and pulls on the rope with all his godly might, but cannot untie the knot. Thor declares that this is trickery, and it will not stand. "I am Odin's son, and I will not have it. Upon thy head be it." Upon thine head? Are you sure? Loki says this is the part of the tale that never changes. Thor now looks at these actions with shame. In response to his own inability to open the bag, Thor climbs upon Skrymir, who all evidence indicated did Thor no wrong. "Odin and Buri, forgive me. 'Tis a tale of what was. But I swear I am not as I was. I am no longer this. Not this. Not this!" Skrymir then awakens, and says that he had a very pleasant nap, except that he felt something like a leaf or an acorn fall on his head. Thor says it was nothing at all. Then Skrymir looks into the forest and sees that they are closer to home than he thought. Behold, Utgard Hall. Once again, the story here is pretty much the same as the other 2 versions, but Thor's attitude here helps highlight the differences between Thor in myth and in Marvel. The myth Thor is more impulsive and usually more prone to anger, whereas Marvel Thor mostly grew out of this behavior when he learned humility. Also, while both versions of Thor are honorable warriors who act as the protectors of mankind, Myth Thor needed very little excuse to kill the Jotnar. That's not to say he was unjustified in this. If Thor fails to keep the Jotnar in check, all of mankind will perish. In Marvel, the Jotnar are better kept in line. Peace treaties and barriers have made it so they rarely cause any problems anymore. So Marvel Thor typically needs a good reason to kill Jotnar. In fact, Thor got himself banished to Earth specifically because he decided to ignore one of these treaties and attack them without due cause. Those events caused him to learn humility and mature. As Thor says, he has changed from the arrogant young god who would kill for wounded pride. It's also here that we see the extent to which Loki's spell works. Thor is forced to live out the story that Loki tells, even if he desperately wants to avoid it. The image of Skrymir seeing Utgard Hall is shown in the comic that Dario Agger is reading. But he notes that the story is changing as he reads it. Amora the Enchantress says that it is skald magic, but that two can play at that game, and the prize for that game is the mighty Thor. If you look closer at the comic cover, you'll notice that Agger is actually reading Thor number 272, and according to Agger, the story is changing as he reads it. As Loki says, his skald magic can change how a story plays out, and it seems like that is what is happening here. At the moment, there aren't too many differences between the Immortal Thor number 6 and Thor number 272, but a few do pop up, like how Thor has Jarnbjorn and the mysterious Black Bridge. I imagine that there will be even more in the next issue when we'll actually meet Utgard-Loki proper. Still, what exactly is going on here? Loki's spell seems to not just retcon previous stories, but change the contents of a comic book from our world. I'm really curious to see what happens next. Overall, this was yet another good entry in Al Ewing's Immortal Thor series. I will say that I personally found it to be one of the weaker issues since half of it was a story I've already read twice before, but on the other hand, I understand that Ewing can't just tell new readers to hunt down Thor number 272 or to read the Eddas in order to understand what happened in the original story. And I am happy that Ewing continuously incorporates elements of Norse mythology into this series. There were many great teases, and I feel like we are really getting into the meat of the story. Tornos was an issue that Thor had to focus on, but now he can get back to the larger story. I say this every issue, but I have to keep saying it. Kokalo's art is amazing, and the whole story as a whole is as well. Well, that's all for this episode of Thor Talk. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoyed the issue. Ewing continues to succeed even when he's essentially retelling another comic. And if the previews are anything to go by, he's going to continue to succeed. With that being said, see you next time on Thor Talk, where...
You'll behold in breathless